Welcome to CIVILNET. My guest today, again, is Professor Keith Watenpaugh, who is at the University of California, Davis. He's a scholar of the modern Middle East and also heads the Human Rights Initiative there. And these days, it is both of his expertises that are being called to play, because we're going to be talking about Syria, certainly a key part of the modern Middle East, but a place where human rights issues are really already taking center stage, and I guess that was to be expected. Keith, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Keith, the human rights catastrophe that's already beginning, it seems, and unfortunately is probably doomed to continue, is that part of simply the anger and the lack of restrictions, lack of law and order, or is what is happening to children, kidnapping, is all of that just a tactic for either side to win what seems to be an unwinnable battle?
Long before the civil war began, Syria had an absolutely abysmal human rights record. Syria was really always at the top of the list of human rights abuses by Human Rights Watch. But the civil war has taken what were dozens of cases and changed it into hundreds of cases of abuse, including the routinization of torture, the use of sort of an interior network of gulags or prisons where Syrians who are suspected of supporting the rebels or not being loyal to the regime are moved from prison to prison to prison. And of course, the treatment of children in Syria was what sparked the civil war in the first place. We know that in the southern Syrian city of Deraa, it was a group of young people, teenagers, some as old as 17 years old, who put graffiti on the walls of their city in the spirit of the Arab Spring, denouncing the regime in Damascus and the brutal treatment of the children, of the young people at the hands of the government is what spurred on a series of uprisings in southern Syria. But we also know, certainly in what was going on in Homs and Hama, is that one of the preferred tactics of the Syrian regime was to kidnap or at least arrest the children of activists and hold them as a kind of hostage for the compliance of their parents. So Syria went into the civil war with a terrible human rights record, and that human rights record has just the abuse of human rights has really spiraled out of control in the country.
But the abuses are not just by the government.
Right. And the thing is that we also know that on the rebel side, even though that the rebels have told the United States and Turkey and other groups that they want to abide by the Geneva Convention, we also have widespread reports of forced ethnic cleansing of non-Muslims from central Syria, the execution of prisoners, and even though the Syrian army claimed that they weren't going to do this, they have allowed young people to fight on their side, child soldiers. And international law really is pretty clear on this.
The Syrian army or the Free Syrian Army?
Free Syrian Army. If you're under the age of 17, you should not be holding a gun. And so there are human rights abuses on both sides, but I would argue that the bulk of human rights abuses going on in Syria today are taking place at the hands of the Syrian government. I mean, the most egregious examples of this are the bombing of civilian neighborhoods, the indiscriminate attack on civilian neighborhoods, which ultimately is a tremendous human rights abuse.
So when the U.S. government promises humanitarian assistance, how does that really translate into real humanitarian assistance?
Well, right now, the Syrian government is only letting the International Red Cross, Red Crescent, bring humanitarian assistance into places like Aleppo. And they're able to feed tens of thousands of families for very short periods of time. But the humanitarian assistance that the United States is building up along the Turkish border is primarily to assist refugees who have crossed that border. So, and even in that case, the amount is insufficient. But what's important is that humanitarian assistance is a way for the United States and other pro-rebel groups to funnel aid and materiel to the rebel armies. In many cases, rebel armies need access to refugee camps because at refugee camps they can get food, they can get water, they can get medical care, they can also have a place to recover and recuperate from fighting. So, but right now, my sense is that Syria is facing a mounting humanitarian crisis. In other words, that tomorrow there'll be more refugees than there are today. and there'll be more the next day and the next day and the next day, and that the international community is so far behind in preparing for the humanitarian crisis that we could see real suffering along the Syrian-Turkish border and also the border with Jordan, but that when finally I think at some point the Syrian, the country itself will begin to really collapse, we won't have, the international community won't have enough material to really help the suffering inside the country.
And really, you're talking at this point about assistance to refugees, the internally displaced. The international community is not in any position to really intervene.
Right. The Syrian government has not made it very easy for international aid organizations to even find out what's happening to the internally displaced people, or IDPs. And really, in this crisis, there are probably more IDPs, internally displaced peoples, who have been forced from probably from the countryside into the major cities of Syria. And, their suffering is just as acute as those who have made it to refugees along the border.
How do we talk about the border, about Turkey, about Turkey's confused sense of both mission and reality? It rejects the Alawite regime in Syria. It wants to support the Sunnis, but this is a country that's heavily sectarian, and if there's ever going to be peace, it's going to have to be peace for everybody. But then Turkey hasn't quite reconciled that for itself within Turkey. How does it see itself as, what did Davutoglu say, the owner, the leader, the defender of the Middle East?
Right. Well, I think that I'm a historian, of course, and I always sort of think about the Ottoman Empire, and we've been, for many years, been thinking about this idea of new Ottomanism or neo-Ottomanism, where Turkey, which really is the regional dominant power, both militarily and economically, will seek to assert its control over places like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, both in terms of politics, but also they want markets for their growing economy. But Turkey is caught in a very interesting dilemma here. On the one hand, it's wanting to promote a kind of liberation movement. On the other hand, it still has a terrible internal record of its own human rights adherence to human rights norms,
minority rights.
Right, vote and right. We're getting these very interesting reports of increasing sectarianism in Turkey itself, pitting the local Alevi minority against sort of resurgent Sunni nationalism, if you will, where Alevi Turks are being attacked by their Sunni neighbors, and Alawis, especially in the southern tier of Turkey, are increasingly identifying with Bashar al-Assad and the regime in Damascus. But I think the important thing here is that in any post-Assad Syria, Turkey will become the dominant partner, the dominant presence in Syria. And I think that for Armenians, this will have both benefits and drawbacks. On the one hand, we do see to some extent a softening of the Turkish position on the Armenian issues, but not anything that we would really want to see. A kind of recognition of the genocide, an open border with Armenia, anything along those lines. But there is a softening, just as there's a softening on the Kurdish issues. And, if we were to look now, as opposed to, say, 10 years ago, things have, in fact, are very different. But I think Armenians would be well positioned in a new Syria because of their traditional role in international trade to really interface well with its, access to Europe, that a Turkish, an increased Turkish role in Syria would. But on the other hand, I don't know if this is what the Armenian communities of Syria really want to do. Is essentially a kind of new Turkish role in Syria may make them very uncomfortable, and I think rightly so.
Let's talk some more about the dilemma of the Armenian community, because whether it's the remnants of life in a society where access to information was at best faulty, that's being polite, whether it's because this community has had, in fact, to live by juggling amongst all the various interests over the various rulers, for whatever reason, this community, for all its resilience, continues to see things black and white, and has more or less taken itself out of the possible position of being a flexible player in this power game, if we're not going to call it a war. And given that, where do you see it going?
I'm not sure that's exactly the case. I mean, historically, the Armenians have been very flexible. And I imagine what's happening is you have, even within families, people are making contacts with the rebels or trying to line up relationships with the Sunnis who will eventually take over Syria, but also trying to at least not offend the regime too much. But, our reports are fairly clear is that, in Aleppo, Armenians have been affected by the war, but not directly. I mean, they've been.
So far, not directly victimized, yes.
But here, there's a couple important issues to think about. One is that right now, the most ferocious sectarian elements of this conflict are directed against the Alawites. Where we've seen some incidents of ethnic cleansing, and any incident is too much in places like Hama and Homs, what we're seeing now are fatwas being issued saying that it's okay to harm an Alawite without consulting an imam. That, in other words, it's almost open season on the Alawites of Syria. And so, moving forward, what we're looking at is a potential for a horrible conflict pitting the Alawite minority against a Sunni majority. Now, from the perspective of Christians and Armenians in Syria, you don't see the vitriolic the kinds of statements being made against Alawites against Christians at this point. Now, that doesn't mean it won't change, but it does mean that the Sunni, and there's whole bunches of different groups and cadres, that for people like Al Qaeda groups in Syria now, that they're really making a distinction between Alawites and Christians. And that Alawites are somewhat worse because they're heretics, whereas Christians are still people of the book and should be protected. But it's also just that the identification of this regime that has oppressed the Syrian people for so long with the Alawite group, and that's what's going to harm the Alawites when this is over. And I think that Armenians and others are caught in a terrible position. I mean, these are people who suffered genocide in the past and are very conscious of what it can do and might be in a position to talk about the potentials for this after the war, but I don't see them aligning themselves with the Alawites against the Sunnis in Syria. So Armenians are caught in a very difficult position, and my only sort of advice would be to think about how Armenians can bring to the fore their experience as a people who have faced displacement, a people who have faced genocide, how their history of encounter with these important problems can help reshape a new Syria where human rights are observed, where genocide doesn't take place, where diversity is welcomed and valued. So Armenians have a possible positive role to play in a future Syria.
And one final question about diversity. Aleppo, all of the descriptions of Aleppo in the travel books and everywhere else is about this, historically diverse city that has more or less been preserved in pretty good form. What's going to happen?
I think that Aleppo's diversity is one of the most important aspects of modern Syria. That if you really want, if our vision, our collective human vision of a diverse Middle East is going to survive, it's going to survive in Aleppo, a city where diversity, where people are allowed to follow their own faiths, were able to speak their own languages, is set against a backdrop of commercial and economic success. In other words, people thrive, people prosper, in spite of, or even because of their diversity. And I think that, I've been talking to American policymakers, and I've told them that one of the things I think should be a very important aspect of American foreign policy is working with anyone, the Syrians, the Free Syrian Army, any transitional government, to ensure the persisting diversity of Aleppo. If Aleppo becomes segregated ethnically, if its Christians and Armenians are forced to leave, I don't see how a multicultural, multi-ethnic Syria or Middle East can even survive. So Aleppo is really it's really in the forefront. It's not just a testing ground, but Aleppo will be the symbol of a diverse democratic Middle East, or it will be the site of like a Sarajevo, a place where the experiment in multicultural living of Christians and Muslims living side by side, that it failed. So either we'll remember Aleppo as a place where the worst excesses of ethnocentrism failed, or we'll remember Aleppo as a place where those horrible fires of hatred succeeded, and what made Aleppo so special will no longer be the case.
Well, as so many of our grandmothers used to say, inshallah, it's the first and not the second. And thank you for talking to us again. I think that it's worth a future conversation, with you, not just about Syria and the developments there, but also about the Balkan parallels. So many people are drawing those parallels, and perhaps there's a lesson to be learned there, both for minorities, Armenians, as well as for those actually fighting this fight and trying to come out on top. Thank you, Keith Watenpaugh, for speaking with us. Keith Watenpaugh from the University of California at Davis, a scholar of the modern Middle East and head of the Human Rights Initiative there, and someone who follows the events there day to day and helps us try to understand what is going to be a matter of great import for the region, for the world, and certainly for Armenians around the world. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching CIVILNET.